Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to do the general introduction again for the class. I'm Deborah Satz, and along with Paul Brest, I'm co-leading this class for the second time. And as you know, because the class is put up for public viewing a week after, and because people drop in for specific classes, we recap the aim and purpose of the class each week, and then after I do that, Paul will introduce today's topic and today's speakers. So what's the class about and what's its purpose? Deep disagreement pervades our democracy on many, many issues, many very important issues, from questions about immigration, taxation, foreign policy, reparations, the Middle East crisis, to the function of elite higher education and the value of free speech itself. One slogan that I've put out for this class is that disagreement by itself, not an issue of concern, and that's because disagreement is a feature of a democratic society, not a bug. We should expect where people are free to think for themselves, to gather information, to bring to bear their own perspectives, where knowledge is incomplete, and where value questions are ones that admit of different priorities, reasonable people are going to disagree. But not all disagreement is productive, and part of this class's purpose is to model and explore the reasons behind disagreement. Sometimes we'll see those reasons turn on the quality of the evidence or the fact that evidence is compatible with multiple theories or explanations. So you can think of two forms of mathematics that both describe the world equally well. There might be no way of telling between them on the basis of the evidence. Sometimes you're in that situation. Sometimes the evidence is just incomplete, or there are different kinds of evidence that you have to figure out how to sort through. We've seen that in some cases where people have demographic evidence versus clinical evidence, and you can come to different decisions based on the evidence. Even when we have the same evidence, as I said, people will make different trade-offs between the different values that are involved in ranking different responses to that evidence. And I can say this because I'm not an empirical social scientist. I am a philosopher who not weighted down by evidence. But it's like amazing to me how often, even in the light of good evidence, we get things wrong. And that's because reality is pretty complicated, and there's just a lot we don't know, and we're not really good at making predictions. So that's the aim of the course, is to explore that, to explore what evidence we have, where evidence can rule out some views, because it's not, as I said, it's not all disagreement that is productive or compatible with evidence. With that, I will turn it over to Paul, who's going to introduce the speakers, the topic, and say something about the question.
One difference between the order of this course today and in previous weeks is we decided to do the attendance a bit later in the course. The attendance, in addition to asking you to say whether you're here or not, ask for some feedback, and it's a little bit hard to do feedback before you've actually experienced the speakers. So that will come later. So speaking of thinking about things in advance, Deborah and I created the syllabus for this course during the summer and fall, and perhaps we were prescient, but But in any event, it's just worth noting some of the coincidences between some of our recent conversations in the class and current events. The conversations about the structure of the U.S. Supreme Court and presidential immunity both assume some traditional theories about the relationship between the federal judiciary and other branches. Recent events have highlighted these matters more than we could have imagined. And last week's dynamic conversation about the roles and effects of programs designed to promote inclusion on campus assumed that Stanford had discretion to come to its own conclusions on these matters. But in the intervening week, the Department of Education has informed U.S. colleges and universities that this is going to be significantly governed by federal policy. My own hope is that the issues discussed today do not become as prominent as some of these and as sudden, at least for the remainder of the winter quarter. The assigned readings on U.S. policy toward China reveal some stark differences, perhaps even greater than the class has just mentioned. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of difference about the facts on the ground, or even about fundamental values, but the diagnoses of the problem, and especially proposed solutions, differ vastly, from seeking U.S. victory over China to containment to accommodation. We're extremely fortunate to have two major observers and scholars of these issues with us as guests today. Thomas Fingar is a Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies here at Stanford. From 2005 to 2008, he served as the first Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and concurrently as Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. Before then, and this is a long list, he served as Secretary of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis, Director of the Office of Analysis for East Asia and the Pacific, and Chief of the China Division, and he's also held a number of positions at Stanford, including Senior Research Associate at the Center for International Security and Arms Control. Dr. Fingar is a graduate of Cornell, where he got an AB and he got an MA and PhD here at Stanford. Glenn Tiffert is Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a historian of modern China. He co-chairs Hoover's program on U.S., China, and the world, and also leads Stanford's participation in the National Foundation's Secure program, a multi-million-dollar effort authorized by the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 to enhance the security and integrity of the U.S. research enterprise. And I think later on we'll be talking some about the research enterprise. Dr. Tiffert collaborates closely with government and civil society partners around the world to document and build resilience against authoritarian interference with democratic institutions. He works extensively on the security and integrity of ecosystems of knowledge, particularly academic, corporate, and government research, science and technology policy, and domestic and international affairs of the PRC, and malign foreign influences. Dr. Tiffert earned his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Both of our guests have written extensively about U.S. foreign policy, including relations with China, but rather than list their books, we'll let you hear directly from the two experts. Before we do that, though, we'd like to put up our poll and have you take out your cameras and answer the polling question. This is more complicated than in previous weeks. So take your time. And I'll now turn the podium over to Tom, who will begin the discussion.
First task is to get the lighting right so I can see my notes. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this, I think, very, very necessary class. That, let me add a little bit on my own background beyond the positions held. I think it's important to understand how I think about the U.S.-China relationship. I'd be what academics would call a participant observer. I've been involved directly in the U.S.-China relationship since 1972. I was on the American delegation that received the Chinese ping pong team. In the Ford and Carter administrations, while here at Stanford, I headed the outside team to develop strategies to build a new relationship. And then from Reagan through Bush 43, I was in positions analyzing and shaping the relationship. The other relevant one is the last 15 years, those positions, I had 193 countries, all issues. So I think about China not simply as a China specialist, but in the context of U.S. global issues and global engagement, and not issue by issue, but the interconnection of issues that span countries and span regions of the world. What I want to do in these opening remarks is in part to frame the issues. It's important to understand how we frame them. This part Glenn and I did not coordinate, so I'm not sure how he's going to approach it. But I will posit, that policies towards China, as indeed towards all countries, must be rooted in U.S. goals and strategies to achieve them, not point specific, that country, that problem. It's got to be part of the larger fabric of American objectives and strategies for pursuing them. The second is an observation from 60 years of working on China and almost 20 years in senior positions in Washington. China never has been and is not now the starting point or centerpiece of U.S. strategy in the way that the Soviet Union was during the Cold War, when our top priorities were to avoid losing the competition with Moscow and avoiding nuclear war. They were the primary drivers and shapers of security, foreign, and even domestic policies. China does not play that role. The starting point for China and other policies should be, what does the United States want to achieve and what does it want to avoid? May sound simple, but it's not often straightforward. Finding the consensus on these issues is difficult. And then we ask, where does China fit into the U.S. hierarchy of value, the Maslowian? What do we want to achieve most? What do we want to achieve second most? And so on. Where's China fit in that? And how can China and China policy help to achieve goals and avoid unwanted perils? The Nixon-Kissinger idea of a strategic triangle in the early 1970s was designed to use China as a strategic tool to manage the principal adversary, namely the Soviet Union. Beginning in the Carter administrations and all subsequent ones until that of Mr. Trump, have seen China as a useful tool to achieve regional, global stability and U.S. and regional and global prosperity. A commercial approach to the relationship. Now, about a decade ago, a narrative emerged that declared, in quotes, engagement with China to have been both foolhardy and a failure, that needs to be replaced by something different, something more realistic. Having been a part of formulating and implementing that policy, you can understand why I might disagree with that characterization. Policies must be tailored to an understanding of the country you're looking at, you're working on. If policies are not based on a reasonably accurate understanding of the target and the related ancillary places, they're going to fail. The same is true of worst casing, imputing capabilities and intentions that are the worst you can imagine, because if you prepare for the worst, you're ready to deal with anything else. As a policymaker, that's nonsense. Works for the military, but it's nonsense to predicate policies on worst case, which almost never happens. So if you know your precedent almost never happens, then you're building a house of cards on top of something that you know to be false. It's not likely to succeed. Realists, true realists, don't imagine or impute or exaggerate capabilities, somebody else's or your own. Effective policy always requires and also requires an accurate understanding of U.S. needs and capabilities and judgments about trends and trajectories. The current discourse about America in decline, America in chaos, does not track with reality. On any dimension, we can talk about that, but the premise is false. A couple words on understanding China. It's not a place that I'd want to live. It has a lot of wonderful people that share many similarities with Americans. A healthy disrespect for authority, for one. An ability to laugh at ourselves, for another. Patriotism. And I use patriotism rather than ideological commitment. But China has a really lousy system. It's a system that prioritizes avoiding disorder and maintaining control a lot more than it prioritizes self-realization for individuals and many other liberal goals. China has virtually no soft power. People in a lot of countries want to achieve the rapid modernization, increases in prosperity that China achieved. They don't aspire to be like China. We can come back to that if you wish. China's party-state system, which I've described as lousy, is bumping up against the possibility ceiling. It has been tweaked and adjusted multiple times in the last 40 years. It's had rather remarkable staying power, but it won't work forever. And it's bumping up against the limits of what it is, this 19th century ideology with early 20th century institutions. It's simply not appropriate for the 21st century. And that China is in now the middle income trap in terms of development. It's going to be there for a long time. On most of the indicators used to establish middle income, China is at the bottom. It's below dozens of countries that have been in the middle income bracket for 5 decades. It probably will do better than the worst performers, but it is not yet a success. During the last 15 years, mostly characterized as China's rise, the gap between China's performance and the United States has actually widened. It's not narrowed. So what should the U.S. do? Well, China, or specifically the Communist Party of China, asserts and probably believes that war with the imperialist camp, which means us, is inevitable, and that we will do everything possible to prevent China from surpassing the United States atop the international system, okay, whatever that means. And that they need to do everything they can to thwart our nefarious and malicious objectives. They mount an all-of-government, all-of-society campaign to deter and defeat imputed American intentions. Their unrealistically based policies are not going to be any more successful than ours. They judge, mostly correctly in my view, that everything we do vis-a-vis China is motivated by our own self-interest. Among the ways in which this is wrong is that they think it's China-specific. Most of what the United States do are policies adopted to deal with problems in other parts of the world, or generic problems, or to promote American domestic situation. They may have implications for China, but they were not designed specifically to disadvantage China. So I might conclude by noting we have two broad strategic options for dealing with China. One is to put threats and challenges from China in perspective and manage them through diplomacy, through some form of engagement, as we do and have done with most countries through most of history. The other is to attempt to isolate, contain, constrain China, and to focus on specific or little challenges instead of big picture and long-term trajectories. And finally, third countries, many of which are as or even more important to the United States than China is, favor the first option and will not be with us if we pursue the second. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Paul and Deborah for inviting me for this conversation, and to Kaisa for assisting with the arrangements. And it's always a great honor to share the stage with Tom, who across his career has been both a trenchant observer and a shaper of U.S. policy towards China. Whenever I hear Tom speak, I find that I agree with a great deal that he says, and usually it's only in the final steps where we begin to diverge. And so perhaps you'll find some important differences in what we have to say. I think where they really revolve is in the context that we now inhabit today. It is fundamentally different, I would argue, than it has been over the last 45 years of U.S. relations with China. And I'd like to start my remarks with really 4 points. The first being, it's important to realize that U.S. interests and the maintenance of the existing international system are not identical. Indeed, they've been diverging in recent years. And that, I think, compels us to disentangle them and to begin to think about the United States acting less as a system guarantor and perhaps more in its own interests. We often speak, for example, of our alliances with other countries being among our greatest strengths. China has no allies. And yet maintaining the alliances is pulling us in multiple different directions in ways that are, I think, compromising the pursuit of U.S. interests. And so it's valuable, I think, to analytically probe the extent to which the U.S.'s role in the world as a system maintainer may be reassessed as we begin to examine what our interests should be. The second is, and I think it's probably apparent to most people, that the U.S. has for quite some time been overextended around the world, and it's facing increasingly capable and audacious challengers, among which China really is in a class by itself. If you just think about the last year and a half, the U.S. has been a security guarantor in the Red Sea, in Ukraine, in the South China Sea, with respect to Taiwan. It is pulled in a great many different directions and is increasingly acting alone because its key allies simply lack the capability, resolve, will to back it up. And so that, I think, forces a re-examination of the choices in front of us. The U.S. does face a choice, and this is my third point. We can either swim harder against an adverse current, try to close the dangerous and growing gap between our commitments and capabilities around the world, which invite challenge, they invite instability, they invite testing by our adversaries. Ukraine might be an example of that. Or we can lean into that current and significantly redefine our role in the world and our priorities and pick and choose more carefully what is in American interests as opposed to system interests. And I think China really falls into that category. And my fourth point is, such a redefinition really requires defining an affirmative vision for 21st century America that is not limited to the paths chosen in the 1940s or the 1990s, and then marshaling the resources and the resolve necessary to achieve those goals. And this means thinking outside of the box, and it will require re-examining some sacred cows. Simply avoiding conflict with China, obviously no one wants conflict, but simply avoiding conflict is not enough in a world in which our position relative to our adversaries is eroding, and it really just cedes the initiative to them because they get to define the boundaries of where conflict occurs, and we're always stepping back in order to avoid it. I think this has been a history of the last decade or so around the world. We need to be proactive and goal-oriented. They're playing to win, and we really should too. So what does that mean? Xi Jinping speaks about changes not seen in a century as he observes the world before him, and he is right. We stand at an inflection point in history. For years now, the World War II order anchored by the US has been eroding. We've been afraid to say it, to say the quiet part out loud, and challengers have been nibbling around the edges of it. The World Trade Organization, the IMF, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the US-led security architecture in both Asia and Europe are in crisis. The Munich Security Conference, I think, finally began to openly grapple with what that means. And why? Because they failed to adapt to significant changes in the global distribution of economic and military power. And that is what makes this moment fundamentally different to 15, 25, 35 years ago, in which the United States really sat astride the world in a way that no one could challenge. The opportunity and appetite for life-saving reforms of this international order is also fast ebbing away. In the last week or so, I've been watching my European friends in government absolutely lose their minds over what they hear from the current administration. And yet, I think many of us who care deeply about transatlanticism, particularly with regard to its importance for China, have been ringing alarm bells loud and clear for years, and yet the opportunity of the Biden administration, in which a more softer approach was pursued with our allies and partners, was in many respects squandered, in which one went to European capitals talking about, if there's a conflict in Asia, would Europe have our back? And we were told, not really our fight. Now the US is, I think, potentially reprioritizing parts of the world, and to its horror, Europe is discovering they're not at the top of the list. I think, the question really is whether this liberal international order, rules-based international order, survives the current moment. Do we cling to a crumbling order, or do we regroup and redefine a new one? Some would argue that we don't surrender an inch, that we double down on our commitments with major new investments in military hardware and forward deployments. I think in the reading set, that is what Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger would argue. And I think that's a very forceful statement for why the United States does in fact need to step up and compete in a more assertive way. But my own view is a little bit different than that, because I feel like the US, particularly after decades of wars that have produced inconclusive results, the American public has no appetite for that. We have a fiscal time bomb that is ticking. And fundamentally, if we're going to commit blood and treasure to faraway places, the American public needs to be consulted, and we need to have their consent first. Instead, where we need to compete with China, and we need to do so vigorously, is to make America more successful. It should be an America in which government is more responsive to the needs of its people. It should be an America that reinvests in its universities and its science infrastructure. It should be an America that stands up the capacity at home and with those who are in our coalitions of the willing to actually be the more successful model, because nothing sells to the world like success. And the US has not been putting forward the most attractive case for that in recent years. And so the key really, I think, is not to focus on what can we do abroad, what can we do with military hardware, what can we do with all of the sort of attributes of traditional American empire, but rather to make ourselves a more attractive model and more successful model. The United States, I think, is right to begin acting as a more ordinary country and be thinking about its own interests. And to the horror of some of our allies, that does not put them first. It is us simply acting as they do. Germany makes choices with China that are not in US interests, and the US may make choices with China that are not in German interests. This is normal. And so going forward, and what we're seeing today in Saudi Arabia, I think with the conversations regarding ending the war in Ukraine with Russia, and Tom and I will disagree with this, over this, but there is the potential here for the United States to marshal its resources and focus on what the true challenges are for the US. Russia does not challenge the United States the way it does Europe. Europe has the capacity, but not the will, to defend itself. The United States should instead focus its attention on who the principal competitor in reordering the world system, in seizing control of key supply chains, and recentering the world economy around itself truly is. And that is China. And so I think the opportunity here is for the United States, again, not to be belligerent, but to redouble down on what made America great once upon a time that we've lost touch with. That is our people, our resources, our talent, and our ability to deliver things. We put people on the moon, we developed the television, we developed the internet, we developed the interstate highways. We are capable of doing these things, and yet we have forgotten how. And so rather than look abroad, I would say turn inwards. I am not a MAGA person, but I do believe that America has potential for greatness that it has sort of lost the plot on. And for us to, I think, succeed in a world and check the ambitions of a revisionist power like China, it is essential for us to get back in touch with that. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to say some words in response?
Is this on?
Yes, it is.
The quick response is I agree with most of what Glenn has said, as I think he agrees with most of what I said.
And we failed, haven't we?
The real challenge, not just of this discussion, but of real world, is figuring out how to prioritize and what to do, and what elements of contending approaches can legitimately be integrated to produce something better, and which are counterproductive because they're contradictory. The last thing I will say is I want to underscore what, he didn't use the term, but I will, our pogo problem. Very few in this room are old enough to remember a comic strip with Pogo, a possum who was a philosopher. And Pogo observed famously, "We have met the enemy, and it's us." the need for the United States to get its own act together, house in order, do things that we seem to have forgotten how to do. I think we're in complete agreement on that. For purpose of this discussion, it's the how does that relate to our foreign policies or security policies? What's the best way to improve our own situation here in the United States and maintain or enhance our position in the world?
I'm happy to take your questions.
So let me begin with a question for both of you, each of you separately. When you get back to your office this afternoon, there's a call from the White House, and you're asked to address the cabinet and tell them how you think you would be, what they should do to begin implementing each of your visions for the future. And you have several days. You don't have to meet them until Monday to decide who you're going to advise to do what.
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, what we're seeing right now is only half of what I talked about. We're seeing the United States begin to reposition itself in the world in ways that are non-traditional and scary to our partners. But we are not seeing a positive articulation of what we're going to stand for in the future. And so the key thing here now is to speak to those in the administration who I know have a vision for that, but are, I think, waiting for the boss to decide how he feels about these matters, begin to open a path for that. So what does that mean? That means encouraging our partners, and I think it is useful to step up in a way that they have not. The United States cannot want to defend Europe more than the Europeans want it for themselves. The United States cannot want to defend Taiwan more than the Taiwanese want it for themselves. And so perhaps the shock and awe of the last 3 weeks has begun to settle on those countries, the sense that they cannot remain utterly dependent and reliant on the United States. And the key thing then is creating pathways for them to do what we are expecting now that they've been alerted to do so. Then, unfortunately, it is about reversing policies that we've seen with regard to how we invest in our science infrastructure. That is key. And that would be very difficult because, as I understand it, those instructions are coming from the people who are driving policy in the administration. And it would be, I think, there's a potential for tremendous loss there, which would set back everything that I've talked about.
So before turning to Tom, let me just follow up on one issue. So you mentioned strengthening the U.S. and making the U.S. the best that it can be. I think you both agree to that. With that, how is that actually going to affect, and over what period, our relationships with other countries?
So here's one area where I take a different view than Tom. When I travel, and I do a fair bit, and I talk to policymakers and people in the think tank community around the world, what China has achieved in the last 40 years is phenomenally attractive, particularly to lower income and middle income countries. They appear, at least from a distance, to have solved the development puzzle in a way that many around the world, of course, they only see Shanghai and Beijing and the best that China has to offer. But they see something that is deeply attractive. We need, I think, to remind the world that we also have a model that is deeply attractive in other ways, and that is successful and delivers and meets human needs in ways that I think we've been less successful in recent years.
So Tom, you arrive in Washington Monday on the red eye.
I guess I should introduce it by saying I'm not likely to be invited to the White House. I was named, one of 52 people named in one of the president's first 26 executive orders. Specifically, he pulled my security clearances after 54 years because I exercised free speech and signed a letter that he didn't like. But if someone else were to invite me back into the White House, the 3 points I would make, first is agree with Glenn. We need a positive agenda. Positive, not paranoid. That affirming what it is that we are, what it is we want to be, how we want to achieve those goals, how other components of the federal system, the American society, fit into that, and how other countries fit into that. The second gratuitous suggestion would be don't focus on China. Focus on the things we need to do to make America better again, to solve our problems, to be the shining city on this hill, to recapture soft power. The people will want to be like us, as opposed to this distinction I make, be rich, with all of the warts of China. And the third is, remind people that, including outside the United States, China's successful path to development was to engage with the United States and the U.S.-led rules-based international order. A model that China offers is one of integrate with the United States and the U.S.-led systems. That message is not very persuasive when we're running away from and dismantling what we built. So it's go back to basics.
You know, one area where Tom and I might disagree, because I want to disturb this love fest here, is that I do not think that it is a viable or smart strategy for us to expect that China has hit a ceiling or a wall. I think whether it has or hasn't, that's an empirical question. I actually believe that China has quite a bit more runway left to it. And because it has a very different antithetical view of of the type of world that it wants to create for itself, so that it feels safe and the party in particular feels safe, is so orthogonal to our interests. We need, I think, to expect and to maybe believe that, you know, we're not seeing peak China. We should expect more of China and thus raise our game even more. What I'm afraid of, if we believe the peak China hypothesis, then we sit back on our haunches. And we say that all we need to do is outlast them because, you know, like the Soviet Union, eventually they will collapse of their own dead weight. That may come, but I don't know when, and I don't want to hinge our policy and our choices based on the expectation that it is any time in the foreseeable future.
Just that one sentence. We should not be complacent and lazy in our thinking only because of China. It's a bad way to proceed. There will be other rising powers. There are other rising powers now that challenge us in many respects. And a myopic focus on China makes it almost certain that we'll tailor policies to deal with a specific problem and miss the broader ramifications.
So I want to ask about this idea, you know, should we play cooperation or should we play defect? And each of you are sort of saying, well, we have kind of a big strategy. I'm a little nervous about the big strategy because you could think for some things we really need to play cooperation, and for some things we probably should defect. And the example I wanted to give is science collaboration. We face, and this is a very important question for research universities like Stanford, which are under extreme scrutiny for collaborations with universities in China. Of course, there are some security issues that are really important, but we face a lot of problems as a world where unless we should all be pulling in the same direction, and those are about climate change, those are about the spread of disease. You know, if the Chinese universities rise, it's probably not so great for our competition, you know, economic, but it's actually great for the world to have wonderful research universities and so just help me think through, like, big strategy, cooperation or defect, but now I'm thinking, what should we do about research and collaboration around science and knowledge?
I'll take that first. I just concluded 4 years on the National Academy's Roundtable on Science, Technology, and National Security. Kim Moeller, who was Dean of Research when she and I became 2 of the 7 members of this panel. So it's front and center in my mind that international collaboration is not nice to do. It's critical to do for the United States for lots of reasons on it. But just to narrow in on some China dimensions, that what you say about increased capabilities to deal with tough problems, the difference in the strategies that we have had until very recently, we seem to be walking away from it, and China is very different. Their goal is total self-reliance in the sciences, that to be autarkic, independent in all of the major. Ours is not. Ours is collaborative. It's benefit from work by anybody, anywhere who can help solve the problem. Do the math. We're 4.5% of the global population. Our strategy is to utilize the capabilities of the other 95.5% of the world. China's declared strategy is to exploit what they can and do it on their own. The goal is to not need the outside world. Now, we don't want to throw away the 17% of brains that live in China and work on problems. Their strategy explicitly throws away 83%. Who's going to win?
So I think it gets down to trust, ultimately. Because if you trust your partners, then you can agree to work on a great deal, particularly on those larger issues like climate change, for example, and public health, pandemics, and so forth. If you don't trust your partners, then it becomes much harder. I'll give you an example. If you say up here that collaboration on climate change is critically important, I would say yes. But the way that the PRC system works is it takes that fundamental research, which it is absorbing from the openness of our research enterprise. It then develops it, enhances it, subsidizes it massively from the government, and before you know it, you've got entire industrial ecosystems in Europe and the United States in a state of collapse. The German solar industry, the Danish wind industry, the battery industry in the United States. And so keeping it siloed purely in the university, I think, is an artificial constraint. These things are connected deeply. The climate change technology, the science that goes into them have economic competitiveness dimensions. If you're talking about public health, there are human rights dimensions with regard to patient data, human subjects treatment, the privacy of genomic information, in which treatment in China is very different than treatment in the systems that we have traditionally collaborated with. And so when you get down to the level of detail, it is much more complicated than simply saying we face common global challenges. And it's because that layer of trust has now been eroded mutually. China trusts us less as well, that it gets harder to do that. Because our openness allows them to be extremely fast followers, for us to spend the money to pursue the dead ends that don't pan out, and for us to figure out what does work. And then they can harvest that and massively subsidize it and turn it against us. And this is a challenge, even in open science.
This is another manifestation of the POGO problem, that it is slow because it is difficult, because of regulations, because of the way in which we do and don't rely on private firms to go from lab to application in this country. The answer to we have a slowness problem and we've erected too many impediments and we have a faulty incentive structure is not to say China or Germany or France or Israel or somebody else is bad because they've overcome some of those obstacles.
So it looks like both of you are heading in the direction of developing or continuing to develop an industrial policy for the U.S. Is that right? And what does it look like?
So if you had asked me 3 weeks ago, I would not have talked very much about, the crisis in funding of basic research that we now seem to be facing, which is, if pursued to its logical end, breaks the economic model of the research university, puts many of them out of business. It's almost inconceivable that it would be applied the way it's talked about because many of our universities simply could not function at that level. If you had spoken to me 3 weeks ago, I would say that, yes, we need to continue to invest in science at a greater level, but the principal impediment is what Tom just said, which is that we're still doing phenomenal science, but where we are, I think, dropping the ball is when it wants to leave the lab. I speak to scientists here at Stanford who are working on technologies that they would love to build in the United States, and they cannot find the capital or they cannot find the engineers at an acceptable cost to build it at a demonstration stage and prove that those technologies are scalable and commercializable. They have to take it to Asia, simply because we don't have the talent, we don't have the risk capital, and you take it to Asia and you lose control of it. And it's built in Asia where it is done more cheaply, it leaks out, and pretty soon you've taught your competitors how to do it. This is a problem we face over and over again, and so solving those valleys of death is critical. Making sure that we can compete effectively internationally at every stage of the innovation chain is the key. In a way, it almost doesn't make a difference if you own the high ground at the frontiers of science if you cannot build it, manufacture it, and then do the process innovation and the iteration to make it world class. We still own the high ground, but we're unable to sort of manufacture everything else.
So what do we need to do to get there? I'm sorry, and then Tom responds.
No, it's part of the getting there. To pick up on one of the points that Glenn made, we don't have the people, right? We don't graduate enough high school seniors in STEM fields to fill the STEM openings in American universities. By the time you get into the industrial area, were it not for immigration, we'd be much worse off than we are now in terms of translating laboratory science into economic accomplishments. So we've got a real problem there that's an education problem and a social policy. The question Paul asked, do both of us think we would have I say no. I think that's more and a wrong lesson, thinking China is really successful because it has an industrial policy. I'm old enough to remember when Japan was going to overtake us as #1. And Japan had an industrial policy. And we wrestled with it and decided, no, that wasn't a formula for success in the long run. When the bubble burst in Japan, that began to look like the right decision. That I would argue that the CHIPS Act and a lot of the things, more money into science, absolutely, and research. More money into one particular sector and industry. This is a repetition of let's fund the hydrocarbon industry for decades in this. It's a special interest benefit. We need a better system, and the way to get the better system isn't to imitate what the Chinese are doing, who imitated what the Japanese did, and it didn't work.
You know, amazingly, China is imitating us, but they're imitating what we did in the 50s and 60s. They are now building out a national lab system modeled on our national lab system. And they're building massive science infrastructure that is world-beating, which they expect will be the places that everyone wants to be in 5 and 10 years. Taking a page right out of our playbook at a moment where we're disinvesting. And their stuff is going to be a lot newer and nicer than our stuff.
So I have one more question for each of you, and Deborah may have some, and then we'll actually take attendance and then open it up. So, you mentioned in describing Chinese citizens as distinguished from the Chinese government, and Chinese citizens being very much like us, including having a healthy respect for government, have healthy disrespect for government. But I wanted to ask you about, both of you, about two aspects of an autocratic system. One is, if the censorship of the media is what we read it to be, and maybe it's not, then Chinese citizens are getting a very distorted view of both the Chinese government and our government and our citizens. So are they still as much like us as you suggest? And then related, we like to think, in fact, one premise of this course that Deborah and I have had from the beginning is that critical thinking and critical inquiry are key aspects of the American education system at its best. And my guess is, we think this is as important in STEM fields as it is in philosophy or political science. Can China continue having, and how does China continue having, the successes it's having academically in research, for example, if critical thinking in many other areas seems to be suppressed?
Let me take the second one first. I think the constraints on critical thinking that mostly are matters of policy, an instrument of control, because the regime fears instability and public feels instability. I think this is a box they can't get out of. The calls for innovation, creativity, think outside the box, one encounters all the time in China. But the damn next sentence is, but you can't color outside the lines. I mean, it is inherently self-constraining that building AI models that exclude substantial chunks of information because they have dirty words in them, like June 4, that's got to be inhibiting, if not crippling. So another impediment of it is the Chinese education. It takes a long time to learn the language. So you don't get at the opportunities for critical thinking until later in the educational system. So it's a problem that they compound with policy. That the distortion of information, do the Chinese have an accurate understanding of us? No. I mean, it is deliberately manipulated. It's become worse as interaction with Americans and other foreigners has been constrained because we bring in problematic ideas. That China went through a phase where, in their terminology, even the moon was rounder in the West. Everything that was not in China was better. Happily, they got over that and began to again have national pride and respect for what they were doing. But the effort to constrain thinking is not one we ought to abet. It's one area where I think, as I understand the Trump approach of reciprocity, and he's talking about it globally, that I think the Chinese on an information exchange, if we can't do it there, they shouldn't be able to do it here. It's pretty fundamental to society. And I'll close with one of the constants of American foreign policy since the first days of independence was the three goals: security or stability, commerce or sales, and initially it was called souls, but it's people to people. It's professional association to professional association. That kind of interaction is not in the nice to do. It's fundamental, in my view, to the success we've had over the centuries and to the way we go about doing things. And we shouldn't weaken our own capacity. We are incredibly corrosive of authoritarian regimes just by being ourselves. We ought to be ourselves aggressively?
It's really hard to answer your question because there are a great many Chinas, and with tremendous diversity of opinions and perspectives on things. And those of us in the university sphere will very often interact with people who will share our views of the world and our socialization and our priorities. And it's very often to just simply assume mirror imaging and extrapolate from that. I used to work with a lot of law professors in China who would engage with other law professors in China who frequently, they were visiting scholars in the US and they tended to be in the liberalizing camp. And so the assumption was that that was going to be the trajectory of the Chinese legal system. Well, it's because they never spoke to people in the public security apparatus who had predominant power that I think they overestimated the influence of those liberals. And so there's a lot of China that is behind the curtain that one really has to, I think, labor to experience and see and study. What I think is apparent now is that, particularly since COVID, many Chinese who in their daily lived experience, every year was better than the last, had faith in the basic competence of the government to deliver material security, better lifestyle. Even if they didn't get political liberalization, at least they got nicer things. That faith has been shaken, and the sense that China's trajectory is limitlessly upwards is shaken too. And I think there's a political legitimacy crisis for the party. But that doesn't mean that I think their days are numbered. I think it is China still has. One of the reasons that I love studying China, and I keep coming back, is it keeps challenging our assumptions about the way the world should work. You would assume that a country that has that level of ideological control and control over information should not be a science superpower, and yet it is. And if you reflect back on the Soviet Union did amazing science also, sometimes in cities that didn't appear on maps. And so they managed, I think, to square that circle in a way that was functional, and where China is more successful, of course, it is to solve the economic and industrial problem that the Soviet Union horribly bungled. But China is probably able to do phenomenal science and still be a closed, ideologically, straitjacketed society. And I think that's an empirical problem that I think we can challenge our own assumptions about the way the world should work. It's worth studying in the same way that China was never supposed to have gotten as rich as it is now without secure property rights, and yet it did. And so China keeps challenging. I think it forces us out of our ideological comfort zones and think, they weren't supposed to be able to do that, and yet they have.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, the COVID example is an interesting example because, that is a place where you think democracies should do a lot better, and they did, than autocratic regimes, precisely because you want disaggregated information, you want people really getting the word out, being able to mobilize, not in ways that China was not. They did the shutdown, but they weren't able in the end to really mobilize. So that is maybe there isn't an exact ceiling, but you can see why epistemically democracies are better at solving some problems than dictatorships, and that there may be some built-in limits. I was going to ask a provocative question to both of you. So, part of what we look at here is their facts and their values. And sometimes you have the same factual basis, but you might take different trade-offs. So you're thinking about this from the point of view of U.S. interests. Somebody might say, hey, 1 billion people were taken out of poverty in the last decades in a kind of an improvement to some level of human well-being that no one had ever foreseen, or no one ever else has accomplished. Maybe from that perspective, it's really great that China is there because you wouldn't have had that otherwise. And India's played some role, but nothing like what China's been able to do. You could have dictatorships, most dictatorships don't invest in their own people, right? China's an interesting case of a dictatorship which actually plowed a lot of resources back into its own population. So, often we debate, like, from what frame are you thinking about things? And should you be thinking more on a global frame or a US frame? We're prompting you to think from the US frame, and that's really what we wanted you to think about. But somebody could say, well, from a global frame, right, it's been really good for the world that China has plowed its ingenuity and resources and back into its population. Makes China look very different than other kinds of dictatorships.
In particular, it's good for the Chinese people, right? And how did they do that? They did it in the way that Tom suggested. They actually turned their back on communism. The state instead invested in its people, and it enabled them. It built the infrastructure necessary, and it got out of the way sufficiently to allow the Chinese people to create incentives for them to tap into their own energies and entrepreneurial spirit. And to deliver the phenomenal growth that China has experienced by integrating with the world. Xi Jinping has in fact turned his back on that, and there is some extent, if he's actually shackling China. The China that we're concerned about in this conversation is not firing on all cylinders because he will not let it. He's impeding it. And if he wasn't, watch out.
The billion lifted out of, it's not out of poverty, it's out of abject
Extreme
poverty. And that, of course, is an accomplishment. It's appropriate to ask, why were the people of China in abject poverty in the late 1970s, after 30 years of party rule? They got 30 years of counterproductive policy. The key to the reform, reform side of the reform and opening was stop doing stupid stuff. Stop telling farmers what they can and can't grow, how to grow it. The infrastructure is important. I mean, letting people who knew something, and here most of them in a country that kind of do what they knew. And it has lifted $1 billion plus out of abject poverty. That means it's up to $2.41 a day. That's not very prosperous, even in China. Point that Glenn made, the lived experience of the majority of China's population is ever upward. That the bad old days that their parents and grandparents won't talk about is not a constraint on expectations. It's not a constraint on needs in a more modernized, integrated system. So it's not nice to have opportunities in urban situation. The system has to work a lot better than it is, and it has. And part of our message, I believe, should not be China doesn't deserve credit for this. It's here's what's going to be necessary in order to go up the next steps on the ladder, which we certainly want them to do. It's been a fundamental tenet of U.S. policy since World War II. If we can help make other countries more prosperous, rich countries buy more stuff from us than poor countries. And even more, they buy more expensive, more sophisticated stuff where we have a counter advantage. We'll never again be the leading producer of plastic shower shoes. But we produce a lot of sophisticated services as well as products, and increasing wealth is good for us, and it is, of course, good for the people who are richer.
So, going to my remarks, where this gets complicated is a richer, more powerful China run by the Communist Party, and in particular by Xi Jinping, is a threat to East Asia. It has territorial ambitions. It wants to redraw boundaries. And so to the extent that the United States still must consider the interests of its allies in the region, it is a constraint on our freedom to say, China, go for it. Because if China succeeds and gets richer and militarily modernizes, the interests of Japan, Korea, Taiwan are potentially compromised. And so the United States has to think very carefully about that, because ultimately U.S. military assets, U.S. soldiers could be at risk. And without those alliance commitments, in some ways it's a simpler equation. It's something we have to think carefully about.
The sentence I would add to that, though, is the system cannot succeed with the current party state, in my judgment. It's got an inherent contradiction in there, that maintaining control, maintaining the state enterprise model, maintaining industrial policy dictated from the state is not going to succeed. I think they know that. But loosening up undermines the pillars of the regime that they think is necessary to maintain the stability to facilitate further growth. So they know they're choking off growth because of the control, but they fear if they lose control, and lose control because now they've got demands from the, give or take, 800, 900 million people that they know they can't meet in there. And they're afraid of it flying apart, and the citizenry is afraid of chaos more than it's afraid of the incompetent regime.
So I was about to turn this over to our students, but I have, what you just said leads to me to one, I hope, final question, which is, what, if anything, can the U.S. do to facilitate the loosening of control?
Facilitate.
Loosening of control.
I think we overestimate our influence on China. I think the most the U.S. can do is to be the best U.S. it possibly can, and to demonstrate that, and to demonstrate that there are alternatives to the path that China has taken that are more functional, more responsive to people's needs, and then to be patient and let China follow its own course. I am somewhat pessimistic. I think there is an assumption that a China without Xi Jinping, a China without the Communist Party, would be a more liberal China. I would hope that it would be, but I don't expect that it would be. I think there was perhaps that expectation when the Communist Party of the Soviet Union fell. We would have a more democratic Russia. We know how that turned out, so let's suspend assumptions for a moment. A China without Xi Jinping, a China without the party could be a more populist, more nationalist, more dangerous China.
My answer, it echoes what Glenn said. We should not overestimate, we should not assume we have even a small ability to influence China's future sort of through pressure or blandishments on there. The Hippocratic Oath is a good place to start. Do no harm. Don't do things that validate the propaganda and the rationale of the regime, whether it's about us or about the need to have continued, not just party leadership, but a particularly perverse type of regime in there. So not validate by the way we talk it up, by the way we interact with it. And the other, again, getting our own house in order, which to me includes our relationship with all of those other countries that are out there that don't want to see us destabilizing the region, the world, a particular sector of the economy because of the way we act vis-a-vis China in there. That the Chinese people are capable of drawing lessons from lots of places besides the United States. Over the years of normalization and engagement, we tried very hard, the United States, and the policy, to not pose, you need to do this because the Americans demand it, or we want you to do it. We did it in terms of, this is international practice. We'd put it through UN organizations to the extent, the same thing, same behavior on observance of contracts and the whole 9 yards of things, but we should let them discover for themselves of a better way. We cannot give it to them, and we can't coerce them.
So getting the house in order seems to be a common theme, and actually quite a lot of overlap in terms of what that means. So we're going to get our own house in order. First of all, there are 2 microphones so that people who want to continue the Q&A, we have a while. But meanwhile, could we put up the attendance form and aim your cameras at this? And please do come to the microphones.
Way too high-tech for me.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fingar, Dr. Tiffert, for a really fascinating presentation. I have a question related to this consensus that you both have about the need to invest at home to increase U.S. competitiveness. Specifically 2 domestic economic policy areas where I'd be curious if you also share a consensus or not. The first is looking at domestic financing. Do either of you have concerns that the size of the U.S. debt or annual budget deficits are so large that they preclude the types of investments that you'd like to see in either U.S. technology or basic research or even STEM education at primary levels? Or that this level of debt, drives up interest rates to a point that it limits commercial investments in those areas. And then the second domestic policy area I'd be curious about your views is related to antitrust policy, specifically looking at the next kind of or ongoing wave of technology development. Do you see a need for enhanced antitrust policy to drive competition, or are these new technologies such that they benefit from enormous scale that in order for the U.S. to effectively compete in these areas, we need kind of greater agglomerations of capital and power? Thanks.
I have some views on that. Let me start with the first one. I mean, I think the sums that we're talking about that would even make a material difference in investing in our research enterprise are rounding errors in the federal budget. So massive sort of reversal of the trajectory of the last 3 weeks, but also last several years, would not materially affect that. I do believe, of course, that the massive debt that we have and the interests that we have to pay on it are a restraint on the investments we're able to make because they outcompete investments in the capital markets because of interest rates. But at the end of the day, investments really pay or don't pay for themselves based on the returns they generate. And so if those investments in talent, in infrastructure, in basic science return for the economy, for jobs, for the problems that we need to solve as a society, then they're wise investments. If they don't, if they're burned on chasing rabbit holes and hitting dead ends, then obviously not. And this goes to the question, I think, of industrial policy. So it is like, let's make smart investments. I mean, that's an obvious point, but the amounts are not huge in relation to the federal deficit. Remind me your second question very quickly.
Antitrust.
Oh, antitrust, right. I am actually deeply worried when it comes to new technologies that so much of the innovation is moving outside of universities into very large firms. Whether you think about biomanufacturing, whether you think about AI, whether you think about quantum, because they are so phenomenally expensive that those technologies will be privatized, they will not be pursued in ways that are consistent with the public interest, and they will also be extremely fickle. If a firm like Microsoft or Google wakes up one day and decides that its investments in quantum have not generated the returns that justify continued investment, and they decide to step back, where does that leave the United States if we've come to rely on those corporate giants to carry the load for us? And a country like China will not suffer that vulnerability because it has the long-term perspective and investments, even if it does have major corporate players. Now, with regard to antitrust, I do believe that it is critically important for us to stimulate the freedom of ideas to germinate at the level of the startups. Once upon a time, Google was a startup. So DeepSeek, I think, has been a reminder that firms like Meta, let's talk about Boeing, let's talk about Intel, big is not always better. And particularly when there's hyper-consolidation in a few players, then they become highly protective of their share, and they're no longer dynamic, they're protective. So antitrust, I think, is a part of the equation.
Two quick points. One is on the debt problem. I agree debt is a problem, and the downstream effects of higher interest impeding home ownership and investment in businesses and so forth. But I think it's fundamentally a societal problem. The American people want a lot more from government than we're willing to pay for. We're the lowest taxed people in the world. It wouldn't take much of an increase, couple percent, in the effective rate we tax ourselves, and the debt problem becomes very different. Bringing our wants in line with our wallet is, again, a societal problem. It requires political leadership. It requires walking close to, if not touching, the third rail of American politics. But I think that's the way the problem. I absolutely agree that the decimal dust kind of savings from tweaking the current process is not going to get us there. The antitrust one, I have less knowledge and less to say, but I'm remembering when IT&T, the parent of AT&T, was the biggest, richest company in the world. And it was broken up into Ma Bell and the Baby Bells in order to get the benefits of competition that produced the cell phone revolution and what we have now. Antitrust remains an arrow in the quiver of government that ought to be utilized at the right time, not willy-nilly. We shouldn't get rid of it, and we shouldn't be crazy about the way it is used.
Thank you. It's lovely hearing your thoughts. The both of you, to some extent, drew parallels between the United States' relations with China and the United States' relations with the EU. So I'd like to flip that a little bit and ask you to draw parallels between the US-China and EU-China relations. And I was particularly thinking about policies and tariffs around electric vehicles. But if you feel like you want to talk about another example, I'd be interested to hear as well. And what can the US learn, good or bad?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time on this question and a lot of time in European capitals discussing it. There's a fundamental structural difference in the U.S. relationship with China, and that is we have treaty alliances with important countries in the region that are just as important as our alliances with NATO. You know, we have a mutual defense treaty with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, with the Philippines, and we have this strategic ambiguity situation with respect to Taiwan. No European country has a comparable relationship in East Asia, and so for them, the relationship is principally economic. And to some extent now technological. So they're pursuing it through that lens, which is a lens that often leads to choices that cause deep frustration in the most generous circles in Washington and abject anger in those who are feeling less generous. And we saw this expressed in the Munich Security Conference last week. But I've been ringing the alarm bells that patience was wearing extremely thin in Washington for years on the European perspective that Asia, China's only an economic relationship, and that a Taiwan crisis is none of their concern, even though a Ukraine crisis, in their view, is an American concern, reminding them that it's the fourth time in 120 years that we've come to solve a European war. Wouldn't it be nice if Europe would have our back in the case of an Asian crisis? And so the EV situation, I think, look, the challenge for Europe right now is that Europe is increasingly less of a player because its economy is not growing. It lacks the major technological innovation. There are no major like AI companies. Mistral is a small one by global standards. And so it is increasingly less relevant, and the current administration is not shy about reminding them of that, actually. And this is a challenge for Europeans. So it is important for, I think, Europeans to behave. Europe is behaving more like traditional Europe and less like the dream of EU. You have the Germans voting against the EV sanctions, and then, you know, and the Spanish going to Beijing and then flipping their vote after Beijing buys them off. So Europe really has to sort of come to a consensus and act like a coherent party. Otherwise, it's going to be irrelevant in this conversation.
I'm not quite so negative on Europe. That Europe will, probably should, make its own decisions. I would prefer that more of them be Europe, EU kind of decisions than country by country. But deciding what is best under the legal arrangements, the labor, government, labor, corporate relation, very, very different in Europe. A lot of Christian socialist, social democratic state involvement in the economy is more like China than it is like us in it. So we'll figure out what it would do. So it's trust and confidence. I think the Europeans, in doing what is in their interest, what they think is in their interest, is not automatically detrimental to American interest. It does not have to be slavish accommodation of Washington in order for it to solve some problems, exacerbate others, get changed down the road. So I don't worry about that very much. That, again, since I think it's a bad idea to try and isolate, contain, thwart what China is doing, I think that is not the goal of our European partners by and large. So it produces an area of friction that doesn't need to be there. And the flip side of it is, one of the reasons, in my judgment, and having negotiated early normalization documents, that the Chinese agreed to accept the risks of dependence on the United States that is fundamental to the reform, opening, export-led growth strategy, that was because they believed, to an exaggerated extent, that they could cushion the vulnerabilities of dependence on the United States by the relationship with Europe and Japan. So that we didn't resist that, we encouraged Europe to get in there and increase the Chinese confidence that they could play in the rules-based order. The more we try and demand conformity to a single approach, I think the more we reinforce the negative and erroneous stereotypings that exist, not just in China, but in many other countries, of what the U.S. hegemon is all about, hegemon is about in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question in response to something you, Mr. Fingar, said in your opening remarks, when you said that engagement was not necessarily the mistake that a lot of its critics say it was. I think the initial motivation for that in the 1970s in a Cold War context was quite clear when we begin to look into like the 90s and early aughts, where this liberal international order is enabling China to get away with things like IP theft and kind of a lot of other ways of maybe unfairly expanding its role in the world, and it's now using that enlarged role and economic power to undermine U.S. interests. I think a lot of people would say that that continuation of engagement, even if it had kind of the great moral consequences of lifting Chinese people out of poverty, was against U.S. strategic interests. So why do you think that engagement was still worth it? And also, Mr. Tiffert, if you have thoughts on engagement and what comes after, I'd love to hear them as well.
Let me begin by underscoring a point you made, that the motivation for engagement as a policy away was Cold War. Absolutely. This was to apply the playbook that had been successful otherwise, specifically in order to make China a stronger and therefore better partner in what was expected to be the never-ending existential conflict with the Soviet Union and its satellites. That was the motivation. The playbook was basically apply to China the policies that we'd applied to Europe, to our East Asian partners, to make them more prosperous, more secure, and more integrated into a system that we dominated. When you get to the early 90s, when the Soviet Union goes away, the Cold War, it took about a decade for people in the United States and other places to conclude the Soviet Union's really dead. It's not coming back. And hanging on to China in case we needed it was a sensible, in my view, strategy. The Chinese pulled out. Remember, after Tiananmen, the decoupling, we decoupled for the obvious political reasons. After the PLA firing on students on Chang'an, the Chinese pulled back because Tiananmen proved to them that integration with the United States was really dangerous to the stability of the regime. And they pulled back until January of 1992, Deng's famous Southern Sojourn that restarts reform, which happened less than 30 days after the demise of the Soviet Union, where China decided, holy shit, the Americans don't need us anymore as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union. What incentive will they have to continue to support our opening and our export-led growth strategy? And became much more accommodating. So the mix of positive things, joining UN peacekeeping operations when that was a big deal for the Clinton administration. Just for example, joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, joining the Chemical Warfare Convention stuff, the maintenance of international regimes, which is what we were trying to do to replace the Cold War dynamic. Having China a part of that was the goal in it. And it continued the peace and the stability that made East Asia the most dynamic, fastest growing portion of the globe. That the rise of South Korea, the prosperity in Japan, in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, would have been inconceivable, in my view, if U.S.-China relations hadn't retained their basic stability in there. So again, if you think about the bigger picture and the longer-term goal, hanging on to it, even though you've got specific problems. Theft of intellectual property, that really doesn't start until about 2008 or 9. Then it becomes a big problem for us, and we were slow, in my view, we were slow, in part because foreign policy in the United States is substantially implemented by the private sector. And the business community say this is a terrible problem, but don't make it harder to solve government by politicizing. We can deal with this problem. And it's not till about 2014 that the business community, metaphorically, came to the government and said, we can't solve it without running business risks. So you, Uncle Sam, you take it on and you solve it for everybody. And U.S. policy flipped during the Obama administration.
You know, Tom made the argument that inertia had something to do with it, as well as the privatization in some sense of U.S. policy towards China. I think the U.S. position towards China should be evidence-driven. It should be driven by U.S. interests at any point in time. And there was a period of decades in which integration with China, I think, was the smart play. And there came a point, maybe around the time of the Beijing Olympics in the early Obama administration, in which it became, I think, fairly evident to close watchers that possibly that had run its course and we needed to recalibrate. But it took a period of time because of inertia and the privatization of interest for that to happen. And so we should always simply be responding to what are our interests at a particular point in time and not subscribe to a particular ideological or teleological principle about it. Now, I think what we did not anticipate appropriately is there was the expectation that the United States would have a greater influence on China, but that China would be limited in its ability to influence or affect the United States. And that has not been the case. Here in the United States at this particular point in time, our openness, and China has been very good at this, using our openness as a vulnerability, as a way to exploit us either for unauthorized transfer and misappropriation of technology, but also for surveilling populations that thought once they left China and reached the United States that they might be safe to enjoy all of the liberties that other Americans do. And yet there are people in the United States from communities in China who, if they speak freely, know that they will be surveilled by surrogates of the Chinese state here in American classrooms as well. Those of us who teach subjects in the social sciences and the humanities have to worry about the safety of our students because of the ideas that they might express in the classroom. And so this is one way in which the United States openness, which something I believe in deeply, does carry its own ethical burden about how we protect what happens here from the predation of a Leninist state that operates according to a very different set of rules.
We have
Thank you.
2 people at the microphones and less than 10 minutes. Why don't you each ask the question, and then you all answer it, and then we'll look at the poll. Put up the poll while you are at the microphones. Why don't you start, and then you.
My question is mainly to Tom. You said that you think that the current Chinese system is unsustainable. So, and you think that China will naturally liberalize in the long term. Why do you think that, and what do you think the liberalization would look like? Assuming that there's no outside influence or major world events that would change that.
And I kind of have a question in a similar vein almost, but it's kind of Frankenstein. So it came out of Dr. Tiffert's statement that China always, never ceases to change our expectations on how we view the world. Dr. Fingar, you talked a whole lot about how your solution of cooperation and kind of focusing on America first is a long-term solution. What's going to happen in short term? Are we going to have trade-offs there? Is China going to get ahead? Are we going to kind of be in second place for a while, but then it will equal out and we'll come back to first place? How do we kind of square those two? And will maybe the short term influence the long term? How does that whole situation work out?
Will modernization lead to liberalization in China? I think probably. I don't know what the time frame is. That I do think back to when I was the youngest guy in the room in the 70s, when we were hammering out what became known as engagement policy. None of us who are still vertical can remember ever discussing regime change, liberalization and political. The expectation was this is a long-term process here. I still think it's long-term process, but the inherent constraints in the party-state system that impede performance. I agree with Glenn, point he made earlier about there's still unrealized potential in China, but it can't be, in my judgment, realized with the current system. That you can't have a free market economy if you don't have free labor and free capital and free land. That I don't know how you get there on it. It's a constraint in it. So I think, as I joke to my Chinese friends, you guys ought to read Marx instead of just putting his picture up. That the economic base determines the political superstructure. That they're still pursuing a Maoist. The political superstructure can change the economic base. To the extent that China modernizes, whether it's democratic theory or modernization theory or good old Marxism, the system needs to change. If the system changes, I happen to agree with Glenn on a point. A China without the Communist Party is not necessarily a no-problem area for the United States because of patriotism. And I'll close with this. What will cause them to move away from this? I think down deep, my interaction with Chinese leaders, senior party people, there's a very strong element of Chinese patriotism. And at some point, the identification of what is the patriotic thing is what's good for the party thing forces a choice. Do you preserve the party, or do you maintain China's rise, improvement of the life of the Chinese people? I think they'll abandon the ideology.
I'll just say a couple sentences, and that is, if you're looking at it from the perspective of what is good for the United States, because I manifestly want the condition of the Chinese people to improve materially, socially, politically. No question about that. Not the Communist Party, but the Chinese people. But even saying that, let's just look at Putin's Russia. This is a 2-bit petrostate. And yet the disorder and chaos it can throw the world into, with its limited resources, is profound. Even a China that is not succeeding brilliantly, but has interests that are adverse to the United States, is still a challenge to us in a very serious and profound way, even if Xi Jinping is tying one arm behind their back.
So before we thank our guests, can we put up the poll? And all right, so take your time. It's a complicated 2 questions. Provide your answers. While you're doing it, I will not ask our guests to tie the role of patriotism and Taiwan together. That would be another class. Okay, I think we've done that. Let's. Does anybody remember what
What it was.
No, not much change, which is not surprising given the complexity of the issues and the wonderfully knowledged and nuanced comments from both of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.